Have you ever wondered how long you would survive in medieval times? You may think you could handle it, but what if I told you that the life back then was so brutal, so harsh, that you wouldn't last 24 hours? Modern conveniences have softened us. Our comfy beds, reliable health care, and abundant food make us forget just how tough life could be for our ancestors. The medieval era was an unforgiving time, and only the strongest, most resourceful individuals could survive. So, let's dive deep into what life in the medieval world was really like, and why, when compared to today, it might just seem unimaginable. First off, let's talk about the basic necessities: food, water, and shelter. Today, we can easily grab a meal from anywhere: restaurants, fast food, or even just the fridge. In medieval times, food was far from guaranteed, and even if you did manage to find something to eat, it often wasn't what you would consider appetizing or safe. Food in medieval times was simple and, at times, disgusting. For the average peasant, meals consisted mainly of bread, pottage, a kind of stew, and whatever vegetables could be grown in the small gardens surrounding their homes. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for those of higher status, and when it was available, it often came with a distinct odor of rot, since there was no refrigeration to preserve it. People didn't exactly have the luxury of walking into a store to pick up fresh produce or meats. And let's not even get started on how many meals were cooked in one large pot, simmering for days, filled with stale bread and whatever was available. It wasn't exactly gourmet cuisine, it was a fight for survival. But the problem didn't just end with bad food. The water situation was equally disastrous. Clean drinking water was hard to come by, and many medieval towns had contaminated water sources, making it unsafe to drink. The filth, human waste, and disease found in most water supplies were enough to make anyone sick. So, what did people drink instead? Beer. Yes, medieval people often drank ale, sometimes from a very young age. It wasn't as strong as today's beer, but the brewing process made it safer to consume than the contaminated water. The average medieval peasant drank roughly 8 pints a day, including children as young as 5. Imagine a child today having a pint of beer with their lunch. You could say that they were more hydrated than we could ever imagine. What about hygiene, you ask? Well, let's just say that showers, as we know them, didn't exist. The concept of personal hygiene was almost non-existent for many people. Most medieval people took baths once every few months, if they were lucky. And even if they did get a bath, it was often in a communal tub, shared with others. Can you imagine how unsanitary that could be? In fact, some medieval people believed that taking regular baths could make you sick. They believed that water, especially hot water, opened the pores and made it easier for diseases to enter your body. So they went without bathing, and this lack of hygiene led to a variety of skin infections, lice, and unfortunately, a lot of body odor. While we're on the subject of disease, let's not forget about the ever-present threat of plagues. Life expectancy in the medieval period was shockingly low, and diseases like the Black Death wiped out entire populations. In fact, during the 14th century, the Black Death killed an estimated 25 million people across Europe, nearly 1/3 of the population. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries or illnesses could be fatal. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death. This was a world where people lived in constant fear of getting sick, and where survival was never guaranteed. You might think that with all this suffering, people would have at least had some entertainment to distract them from their grim reality. But, unfortunately, leisure time wasn't something most medieval folks enjoyed. For the majority of people, life was about working the land or performing manual labor from dawn until dusk. The few who could afford it might have attended a feast or a jousting tournament, but for most, Their days were filled with grueling work in the fields, making sure they had enough food to last through the harsh seasons. Now let's talk about shelter. Imagine living in a tiny, drafty house made of straw, mud, and timber. Medieval homes were small and cramped, with families often sharing one room. If you were lucky enough to be a part of a wealthier household, you might have had a separate room or two, but it still wouldn't have been what we would consider comfortable. Even the wealthiest homes were cold and poorly insulated, and most people had to rely on a small fire in the hearth to keep warm. This meant that winters were brutal, and people often went to bed with layers of clothing just to stay warm. And let's not forget the animals. Most medieval homes had animals living inside: chickens, pigs, and even cows. These animals provided food, but they also added to the filth and unpleasantness of living conditions. Animal waste was a constant problem, and since there was no plumbing, many people had to make do with outdoor latrines or simple buckets to relieve themselves. In all, the medieval world was a harsh, unforgiving place where comfort, safety, and health were things that only the wealthiest could afford. The rest of the population struggled to survive, dealing with poor hygiene, terrible food, and the constant threat of disease. So, next time you feel like life is tough, just remember, you're not living in the Middle Ages. You wouldn't have lasted 24 hours back then. Now, you may be wondering how people managed to survive all these hardships. If you think it was bad for the peasants, you might be surprised to learn that life wasn't much better for those in power either, at least not in terms of comfort and ease. The aristocracy, the nobles, and even the kings and queens had their own set of challenges. But they did have some luxuries that the peasants couldn't even dream of. Yet, even their existence was still fraught with danger, disease, and discomfort. For the nobility, the greatest threat often wasn't physical exhaustion or hunger, but the constant fear of political intrigue, betrayal, and assassination. The medieval court was a place of power struggles, where the nobility were constantly jockeying for position and influence. Trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal was not just a political maneuver, it could also be deadly. Imagine living your life surrounded by potential enemies, constantly worried that someone close to you might plot your downfall. And then there was the matter of hygiene. While the nobles might have had access to more luxurious items, such as fine clothing and sumptuous feasts, hygiene was still a major issue. Much like the peasants, they often went without proper bathing facilities. Noble households might have had private baths, but even these were infrequent and not exactly the epitome of cleanliness. They lacked the kind of sanitation systems we take for granted today. Think about the absence of plumbing in even the grandest castles. There were no showers, no hot water on demand, and no way to wash away the filth that accumulated over time. It was an uncomfortable life for both the rich and poor, with little reprieve from the grime and odor that permeated everyday life. Noble families often employed physicians, but these doctors weren't much better equipped to help with medical issues than the peasants. Many of the treatments they provided were based on outdated theories and misconceptions. If you were wealthy, you might be able to afford a visit from a learned physician, but in reality, most medieval doctors had limited knowledge of how the human body worked. They might offer bloodletting or other bizarre remedies that, rather than curing you, would often make things worse. Disease was rampant, and without antibiotics or vaccines, even minor illnesses could be fatal. If you contracted the plague or any number of other deadly diseases, you were essentially left to fend for yourself. The rich also had to contend with a lack of modern amenities that we take for granted today. Imagine having to sleep in a bed made of straw or wool, with no soft mattresses or comfortable sheets to cushion your body. Castles and noble homes had heavy wooden beds, which could be terribly uncomfortable by modern standards. And the beds themselves often harbored pests, lice, fleas, and even bedbugs, adding to the overall discomfort. Even if you managed to avoid the bite of a pesky bug, the lack of proper ventilation meant that you often woke up hot, sweaty, and surrounded by the musty odor of unwashed bedding. Another area where the wealthy were at a disadvantage was clothing. While the rich had access to fine silks, furs, and other expensive fabrics, the garments were often ill-fitting and uncomfortable. In fact, many of the noble garments were designed more for status than comfort. Think about how heavy, restrictive, and difficult to move in these clothes were. The tight corsets, layers upon layers of fabric, and elaborate embellishments might have made them look grand, but they were far from practical. You might look like royalty, but you'd certainly feel like a prisoner in your own clothes. And then there were the castles. Sure, they were massive and impressive, but they weren't exactly designed for comfort. While castles provided a certain level of protection and grandeur, they were cold, drafty, and often poorly insulated. A medieval castle might have towering stone walls and massive iron gates, but it didn't come with modern heating or cooling systems. The chill of winter would seep through the stone walls, and the only way to stay warm was by huddling around a hearth fire. This meant that the nobility, too, had to deal with the brutal realities of winter, living in drafty rooms with nothing but their heavy clothing and the warmth of a fire to protect them. Now, let's shift gears and talk about something that was on everyone's mind: death. In medieval times, death was an ever-present companion. It wasn't just a distant concept. It was something people faced every day. Life expectancy was much shorter than it is today. The average person in medieval Europe lived only into their 30s or 40s. Child mortality was high, and it wasn't uncommon for entire families to be wiped out by disease, famine, or war. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and even a small injury could lead to an agonizing death. War and conflict were constant threats as well. The medieval period was marked by battles, sieges, and the constant fighting of rival factions. The idea of a medieval knight might sound romantic, but the reality was far from glamorous. Knights were trained warriors, but their lives were often brutal and short. They fought in bloody battles, many of which ended in massive loss of life. And even if a knight survived a battle, they were often left with debilitating injuries or diseases that could shorten their lives. The life of a medieval warrior was one of constant danger, and surviving a battle wasn't guaranteed. Now let's talk about one more thing that would make medieval life almost unbearable: the sanitation, or lack thereof. Today, we take toilets, showers, and clean drinking water for granted, but in the medieval world, these basic comforts didn't exist. The absence of proper sanitation systems meant that waste often piled up in the streets, leading to the spread of disease. Cities were often dirty, smelly places where human waste was disposed of in the open. This unsanitary environment was a breeding ground for illness, and it's no surprise that the plague spread so quickly through Europe during the medieval period. So, what does all this mean for you? Well, if you think your life is tough now, just remember, you could have been living in medieval times, where basic survival was a constant struggle. We've come a long way since those dark ages, and while modern life comes with its own challenges, it's nothing compared to the hardships people faced back then. The medieval period was a time of suffering, disease, and constant danger, and most people wouldn't have survived even a day in that world. So the next time you find yourself complaining about your life, take a moment to appreciate the comforts and safety we enjoy today. Because, trust me, you wouldn't have made it in the medieval world. Let's dive into another crucial aspect of medieval life: work. In the modern world, we have the luxury of a variety of career choices. Some people work in offices, others work remotely, and there are those who work with their hands, in creative fields, or even in technology. The work we do today may feel grueling at times, but it comes with a level of freedom, choice, and a relatively fair balance between work and life. However, in the medieval world, this was far from the case. Life was defined by labor, and for the majority of the population, it was a daily grind with little hope of escape. The overwhelming majority of people in medieval times were peasants, and they worked the land, often from sunup to sundown. A typical day started early, and for most, it meant long hours of physical labor in the fields, tending to crops and animals. This was not a leisurely existence. It was back-breaking work in conditions that were grueling at best. Whether it was plowing, planting, or harvesting, the cycle of labor was endless. And unlike today, there were no labor laws to protect them, no weekend breaks, and certainly no paid time off. The work was all-consuming, and failure to perform it meant the difference between survival and starvation. Farming was dependent on the seasons, and the medieval peasant had no way of predicting weather patterns or dealing with crop failures. A bad harvest could lead to famine, and without proper storage methods or refrigeration, food could spoil rapidly. It was not uncommon for entire villages to starve during the winter months if the harvest had been poor. While some wealthy landowners and nobles had access to surplus food and luxury items, the vast majority of people struggled to fill their bellies. But even for those who were not farmers, the work in medieval society was far from ideal. For example, tradespeople such as blacksmiths, cobblers, and weavers worked in small workshops where they often toiled for long hours under tough conditions. They used rudimentary tools that required manual labor, and their output was often used for bartering, meaning that economic stability was a constant concern. Artisans and craftspeople had a somewhat better standard of living than peasants, but they still lived on the edge, vulnerable to disease, injury, and the whims of their patrons. Let's also talk about one of the most difficult, physically exhausting, and dangerous jobs of the time: mining. Miners in the medieval period worked in brutal conditions, extracting valuable metals and minerals such as silver, gold, and iron from deep within the earth. They used crude tools, sometimes just picks and shovels, and worked in cramped, poorly ventilated tunnels. The danger of cave-ins was a constant threat, as were the risks of inhaling toxic dust or gases. The conditions were so harsh that mining became one of the deadliest jobs of the time. And even though miners were often paid poorly for their work, the rewards of precious metals meant that they were often pushed to endure these conditions, regardless of the personal cost. As for women, their roles in medieval society were defined by their position in the family and their economic status. The majority of women worked alongside their husbands, helping with farming or running small businesses. However, women had far fewer rights and opportunities compared to men. They were expected to marry young, bear children, and maintain the household. Their work often went unrecognized, and while some could hold positions as healers, midwives, or even businesswomen, they faced significant societal restrictions. Women, especially from the lower classes, were often subjected to grueling labor with few privileges or rights. Now let's turn our attention to the deadly social issues of the time, starting with the ever-present threat of war. Medieval society was constantly at war, whether it was local skirmishes or full-fledged invasions. The threat of violent conflict was something that everyone, from the highest nobility to the lowliest peasant, had to live with. Kings and queens fought for power, knights and soldiers fought for land and honor, and peasants were often caught in the crossfire, conscripted into military service, or simply pillaged by invading forces. Warfare in the medieval period was brutal, and there were no modern rules of engagement to protect civilians. Villages were razed, families were torn apart, and countless lives were lost in the name of power and conquest. For the average peasant, war was not just a distant conflict. It was a direct and often brutal part of life. When wars broke out, They could result in the destruction of entire towns. Armies would sweep through, looting and burning villages, taking whatever they wanted, and leaving destruction in their wake. The notion of safe or protected areas didn't really exist. When a conflict erupted, there were no neutral zones. Everyone was a target. And even if your town wasn't directly affected by the war, the disruption of trade and travel could result in famine, making life even harder. But it wasn't just war that posed a threat. It was also the ever-present fear of disease. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory or how diseases spread, so outbreaks of plagues, fevers, and other illnesses were often seen as acts of God or the result of witches' curses. The Black Death, which wiped out millions of people in the 14th century, is probably the most famous example of how devastating disease could be. But it wasn't just the Black Death. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and other deadly diseases were rampant. And since there was no reliable medical treatment, people had little recourse for preventing or curing illnesses. The average life expectancy in the medieval world was much lower than it is today, and death could come unexpectedly. This brings us to another stark reality. The medieval period was marked by a general lack of understanding about hygiene and sanitation. Medieval people didn't have the knowledge or technology to keep their environments clean and disease-free. As we discussed before, the water supply was often contaminated, and there was no such thing as modern plumbing. People lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and waste disposal was rudimentary at best. It wasn't uncommon for people to throw their waste into the streets or out of their windows, creating breeding grounds for illness. The idea of cleanliness was often an afterthought, and most people lived in a state of perpetual filth. This lack of sanitation and medical knowledge meant that when an epidemic did strike, it could wipe out entire communities. With no antibiotics or effective treatments, medieval societies were at the mercy of the diseases that spread through them, further complicating the already harsh realities of life. In conclusion, whether you were a peasant working the land, a noble living in a drafty castle, or a tradesperson trying to make a living, medieval life was far from easy. Constant work, deadly disease, the threat of war, and a lack of basic comforts were a daily reality for nearly everyone. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine that life in medieval times was filled with knights, chivalry, and great battles. But the truth is much darker and more difficult to endure. If you were transported to the medieval period, chances are you wouldn't make it more than a day. Survival was a constant struggle, and few people escaped without suffering. So, the next time you complain about the challenges of modern life, remember just how much we've advanced. Life today, with all its complexities, is still far more comfortable than what our ancestors endured. As we continue to explore the grim realities of medieval life, it's important to understand the system that governed daily existence, the feudal system. This was the backbone of medieval society, where the social structure was rigid, and your position in life was determined by birth, not by merit or ability. The idea of social mobility was virtually non-existent in this era. If you were born a peasant, you would remain a peasant for your entire life, bound to the land, working for the benefit of your lord. And if you were born a noble, you could expect a life of relative privilege. But that didn't necessarily come with the ease and comfort we might imagine. The feudal system was structured around a series of obligations and exchanges. At the top of the hierarchy was the king, who controlled the land, but didn't actually manage it directly. Instead, he granted large estates to powerful lords, who in turn granted smaller portions of land to lesser lords or knights. These knights, in exchange for land and protection, pledged loyalty to their lords and were often required to provide military service when needed. The peasants, or serfs, were at the bottom of the feudal ladder. They worked the land and produced the food, but they had little to know rights. In exchange for living on the land and receiving protection from their lords, they were required to give a portion of their produce and labor. For the average person, life under feudalism was anything but fair. The peasant class was bound to the land and could not leave without the permission of their lord. They were also responsible for maintaining the fields, repairing roads, and building fortifications when necessary. But this labor didn't translate into wealth or freedom. Instead, it meant that the peasant's life was dedicated to the service of the landowner, with little hope of improvement. If a crop failed or a natural disaster struck, it was the peasants who suffered the most. Serfs weren't completely free. They didn't own the land they worked, and they had no rights to choose where they lived or worked. They lived in small, simple homes with thatched roofs, often shared with animals, as we mentioned earlier. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of nature: spring planting, summer tending, fall harvest, and winter survival. They had little to no control over their destiny, and their labor was demanded by the lord who owned the land. Even if they wanted to change their life, there were limited opportunities to escape. In fact, the vast majority of people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Travel was difficult and dangerous. Roads were poorly maintained, and travel was often restricted by the local lord. Even moving from one village to another could be an arduous and risky venture, as roads were filled with thieves, and local authorities often sought to control where you went. This isolation contributed to a very limited worldview. People rarely encountered others outside of their own community, and their lives were defined by the rules and customs of the village or manor where they lived. Life for a knight or noble was a stark contrast, though not without its own set of challenges. Although they had land and wealth, their lives were defined by the constant need to maintain power and control. The medieval nobility often lived in fortified castles, which were designed to protect them from attack. But these fortresses were often cold, damp, and uncomfortable. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. They lacked basic amenities such as insulation, proper heating, or comfortable furniture. Living in one of these stone structures might sound romantic, but it was far from luxurious. And even if you were fortunate enough to be a noble, you still had to face the dangers of war. The medieval period was defined by constant conflict, and being a noble or knight didn't guarantee a life of ease. While knights fought for their lords and their lands, they were also vulnerable to being injured, captured, or killed in battle. And if you weren't fighting, you were likely involved in political struggles and intrigue, where betrayal and assassination were constant risks. Loyalty and honor were valued ideals, but in reality, they often fell victim to the pursuit of power. Speaking of political intrigue, the medieval period was rife with corruption, greed, and deceit. Kings, queens, and nobles were often embroiled in power struggles, and court politics were complicated and ruthless. Those in power had to constantly watch their backs, as betrayal was common. The quest for power and wealth drove many noble families to engage in brutal acts of treachery. Assassination, poisoning, and espionage were all part of the political landscape, and the average person had little to no control over these power plays. Even the monarchs themselves weren't immune to betrayal. Many were overthrown, poisoned, or assassinated by their own trusted advisors. For those in the clergy, life wasn't much better. The church held immense power during the medieval period, but it wasn't a place of sanctuary or peace for many of its members. Monks, priests, and nuns were expected to live in strict adherence to religious rules and practices. Monasteries were often austere, and the daily life of a monk was defined by prayer, work, and study. The clergy had to follow strict codes of behavior, and failure to adhere to these standards could result in punishment. While some enjoyed a degree of prestige, most lived humble, restricted lives, devoid of the comforts and privileges that wealthier individuals had access to. And even for those who lived in cities, life was far from easy. Towns and cities were overcrowded, unsanitary, and filled with disease. While cities might have offered more opportunities for work, such as crafts or trade, they also brought their own dangers. The population in medieval cities swelled, often outstripping the ability of local authorities to manage the growing number of people. Streets were narrow and filthy, and disease spread quickly in these overcrowded conditions. The lack of proper sanitation and waste management meant that the streets were often filled with refuse and human waste, creating an environment where diseases like cholera and dysentery could thrive. In conclusion, the medieval world was a place where life was harsh, where survival was a constant struggle, and where the social structure trapped people in rigid roles. The feudal system ensured that the vast majority of people lived in poverty and were forced to work tirelessly for little reward. Even the wealthiest individuals were not exempt from hardship. Constant political intrigue, the threat of war, and the dangers of disease meant that no one was truly safe. Life in the medieval period was difficult, dangerous, and defined by hardship. It was a time when survival was the ultimate goal, and any deviation from the norm could mean certain death. So, when you think about the challenges you face today, remember that even the wealthiest individuals in the medieval world were still fighting for survival. Let's move on to another critical aspect of medieval life: religion. In many ways, the medieval period was defined by religion. It was a time when the church held immense power and influence, shaping not only spiritual beliefs, but also political, social, and cultural life. The church wasn't just a place for worship. It was an institution that controlled vast amounts of land, wealth, and power. But living under the thumb of religious authority wasn't always a comforting experience. For many people during the medieval era, religion was their lifeline. The church provided structure, meaning, and hope in a world filled with hardship and suffering. However, it also imposed strict rules and moral codes on everyday life. Religion in the medieval period was not just a private matter, it was deeply entwined with every aspect of life. Every event, from birth to death, had a religious ritual attached to it. And for those living in rural villages or small towns, the local priest was a central figure. They were not just spiritual guides, they often had considerable power in the community, serving as the final arbiter of disputes and a gatekeeper to the divine. For the peasantry, the church was often their only source of comfort. It provided a sense of order and understanding in a world where daily life was marked by hardship. The belief in salvation was a powerful motivator for survival. For peasants, a good death meant eternal life in heaven, and the church promised a sense of stability and hope. The promise of heaven was a reward for suffering in this life. The medieval church's teachings made people believe that their worldly suffering was temporary, but the joy of salvation would last for eternity. This provided some comfort amidst the constant struggle for food, warmth, and safety. However, the reality of medieval religion wasn't always as comforting as it seemed. The church, in many ways, was more concerned with power and wealth than with spiritual enlightenment. It collected tithes, mandatory payments, made up of a portion of a person's income, which for peasants often meant that their labor was taxed by both their lord and the church. The church had vast amounts of land, and its wealth and influence rivaled that of the nobility. Clergy members often lived in relative luxury, while the common people struggled to get by. Moreover, the medieval church's power wasn't limited to the spiritual realm. It played a major role in politics and governance, often acting as the final authority in legal matters. Kings and nobles alike had to seek approval from the church for their actions, and the Pope held the power to excommunicate rulers, which was a political weapon used to undermine their authority. The Pope had the ability to call for crusades, declare holy wars, and even influence wars and politics across the known world. The Church's role as an overarching authority made it difficult for anyone, no matter their status, to escape its influence. But perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of medieval religion was the Inquisition, the Church's attempt to root out heresy and suppress dissenting religious beliefs. The Inquisition was a dark chapter in history, marked by torture, persecution, and execution of those accused of heresy. Those who dared to question church doctrine or challenge its teachings were often forced to recant or face brutal punishment. The fear of being accused of heresy was enough to make many people keep their doubts to themselves. The Inquisition was a tool of control, and the Church used it to ensure that its authority remained unchallenged. It wasn't just those accused of heresy who suffered under religious oppression. Women were especially vulnerable. The medieval Church, like society at large, often viewed women as inferior to men. Women were regularly subjected to harsh moral codes that restricted their freedoms and rights. Women who were outspoken, independent, or accused of witchcraft were often targeted by the Church. The idea of witches, fueled by religious beliefs, led to countless women being persecuted, tortured, and killed. Many innocent women suffered simply because they defied traditional gender roles or were unlucky enough to fall victim to suspicion. While the Church provided a sense of spiritual safety for many, it also cast a shadow over medieval life. It controlled nearly every aspect of people's lives, from the food they ate to the way they prayed. Religious festivals and holidays marked the passage of time, and the lives of the peasantry were governed by the Church's calendar. Yet, in a world where survival was a constant challenge, the Church's teachings on the afterlife were often seen as the only hope for a better existence. The idea of eternal salvation was a powerful motivator for people who lived in an unforgiving world. However, religion wasn't the sole source of control during the medieval period. The political and military landscape was just as influential in shaping people's lives. The medieval era was marked by constant conflict, whether it was between rival kingdoms, feudal lords, or invading armies. The notion of power was a complex web of alliances, loyalty, and betrayal. The idea of chivalry is often romanticized today, but in reality, it was a brutal and harsh code that required knights to fight, conquer, and defend at all costs. War was an ever-present feature of life in medieval times. The nobility, always looking to expand their territories or defend their wealth, engaged in constant military campaigns. The idea of a knight's honor, while noble in theory, often meant that soldiers were thrust into violent and dangerous battles. Knights were highly trained warriors, but this didn't guarantee a life of ease or luxury. They were often wounded or killed in battle, and even if they survived, they lived with the knowledge that their next campaign could be their last. While we often think of medieval knights as glorified heroes, they lived with the constant pressure of upholding their lord's interests. They lived under the constant threat of war, and their role in society was defined by their ability to fight. The brutal realities of medieval warfare included harsh tactics, sieges, and close-quarter combat, which were both physically and mentally exhausting. In addition, even knights faced poverty and a lack of stability if they failed to win battles or if they lost favor with their lords. The life of a common soldier was no better. They were often pressed into service by feudal lords or kings and were subject to the whims of those in power. Soldiers lived in squalid conditions and were expected to march long distances, fight in brutal conditions, and face death without hesitation. They had no choice but to follow orders, and their lives were expendable in the pursuit of political and military goals. At the heart of medieval warfare was the quest for land, wealth, and power. Kings and nobles sought to expand their territories, and they waged wars to claim new lands or to defend their holdings. These conflicts were often brutal and lengthy, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. While the upper classes may have fought for honor or glory, the average person fought for survival, often with little understanding of the political ramifications of the battles in which they were involved. In conclusion, while medieval religion provided some semblance of hope and structure, it also played a large role in perpetuating the hardships of life during this period. The Church's immense power and influence were both a source of comfort and oppression. Additionally, warfare, chivalry, and the constant pursuit of power further complicated the daily lives of both the noble and common people. Life in medieval times was not just a struggle for survival. It was a world where power, politics, and religion intertwined to create an environment of hardship, fear, and little hope for change. In the end, medieval life was a constant battle for survival, marked by hardships, brutality, and an oppressive social structure. From the feudal system that bound people to the land to the unrelenting demands of warfare and religious control, every aspect of existence was shaped by a lack of freedom and relentless struggle. Whether through political intrigue, religious persecution, or the overwhelming challenge of daily labor, the medieval world left little room for comfort or escape. So, when we reflect on how tough life can be today, it's worth remembering just how much our modern conveniences, rights, and freedoms have spared us from a fate that was, at best, one of survival, and, at worst, one of misery. Thank you for watching.